now.
Okay, Irene, thank you. Our speaker today is Norman Kaplan. Norm received engineering degrees from New York University, College of Engineering. Then served on the faculty in the research division. He moved to several industry positions, became director of engineering for Tracor's Systems Division. He joined the staff at the National Science Foundation to serve as program director and division director for electrical, computer, and systems engineering. Norm is a life fellow of the IEEE, past president of the Robotics and Automation Society, and past president of the International Advanced Robotics Program. I know where to go to get a robot to clean my apartment. You're on, Norm.
Thank you very much. Incidentally, just a question. How many people know what the National Science Foundation is?
Yeah.
Nobody here, only 3 people know. 4 people know.
I know.
Okay, one day I'll give a lecture on that. It's a government agency, but it's sort of a stealth government agency because nobody knows it exists. And we're hoping Trump doesn't know it exists. Anyway, we're going to talk today about the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution took place in nominally October of 1917. I say nominally because it wasn't a revolution that you could put a date on. It was a change of government at that time. But fighting really took place afterward and before. It was not a revolution like the American Revolution, which overthrew colonialism and the monarchy. The Russian Revolution really resulted from the Industrial Revolution, where the people of Russia started becoming workers in factories and so on. Previously, I'll talk about that. Okay, so the revolution that overthrew the monarchy, the czars were the kings, if you will, of Russia. They have ruled Russia for past centuries and were, unlike the American and French Revolution, the Russian Revolution not only overthrew them, which was not the main intent. The main intent was to get better working conditions for the workers. The Russian, it was more political. And the fighting between the Red Army and the White Army, which took place afterward, I'm not even going to get to, or may get to that in a later discussion here. But that was the battles that took place. It was after the October date. Okay. And this all occurred in St. Petersburg, which was the capital of Russia in those days, in the early turn of the century. The political change literally took place in 10 days, but a result of many years of unrest and political infighting. To understand these 10 days, we need to understand the culture of Russia, the leaders, the would-be leaders, and the political and economic climate. And more importantly, the personalities of the people who were involved. Because as we know from our present leadership, personalities dominate everything. Okay. So we could start with earlier czars, which the czars go all the way back. I'll begin with the turn of the century, where Russia was a backward country.
Tell them to move over here.
I'm sorry.
Move your chair over so it's to the left.
That better?
Can't see you.
Okay. Gotta keep all of that. Where was I? Russia was a backward country compared to France and England and Germany, which had developed some degree of sophistication at that time. Russia was very backward. The Russians primarily were peasants. It was an agrarian country with very little activity going on in cities. 4 out of 5 Russians worked as peasants in the fields. Mostly they were illiterate. They lived in small villages. Roads and infrastructure was non-existent. Medical care was primitive. and anti-Semitism in Russia was thriving. Nobody liked the Jews. I'll talk a little bit more about the Jews later. The practice of serfdom, I don't know whether you ever heard of the serfs and serfdom. These were agricultural slaves, essentially. They worked for the landowners. That practice had been abolished by Tsar Alexander II in 1861. That's years before the American abolished the slavery in this country and led to a civil war. But a large number of the former serfs were poor and ignorant. You just can't release these people. They had no place to go. So they stayed where they were. They were tied to the rich landowners by indebtedness. And like the American slaves, they had little hope for a better life. Alexander II, who was the Tsar who released the slaves, the serfs, was succeeded by his son after he was assassinated 20 years after that date. So then we got to Alexander III, Tsar Alexander III, and then he was succeeded by his son Nicholas II. So Nicholas Romanov, which was the name of the Tsar's family, Nicholas II was the Tsar of Russia at the turn of the century. And the Tsar and the Tsarina and their son, the Tsarevich, the Russian, to this day I think, the suffix on their names, Tsarevich, Tsarina, the is a woman and the Vich is a boy or a man. So if your name is Ivan, if your father's name was Ivan, your name, middle name becomes Ivanovich if you're a man. Okay, so they lived in a palace beside the Neva River in St. Petersburg, which was the capital of Russia. Nicholas Romanov, the Tsar, was a dedicated person. He was dedicated to duty, but he had little charisma. Oh, he also had 4 daughters. I don't know whether I mentioned that. There was a son and 4 daughters.
Now you did.
Okay. He was not an intelligent guy. He had a little imagination. He was prejudiced, including, he liked a good pogrom every once in a while, kill off a few Jews. That seemed to make him happy.
Made the population happy too.
Yeah, made the population happy too. Go watch Fiddler on the Roof. The Jews at the time lived in what was called the Pale of Russia, which was the part of Poland and the Ukraine and the Russian West there. So they were sort of segregated. They were disliked by the Russians and used as scapegoats for all the injustice in Russia. Nicholas's wife, Alexandra Fedonova, was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, if you will. In those days, the nobility all intermarried, so everybody was a cousin, a granddaughter. Although she was a granddaughter, she was brought up in Germany, so she was basically German. And she was very aloof and unpopular. She looked down on the Russians as being ignorant people. She showed nothing but contempt for the masses, and she was prone to constant sadness and superstition. They had 5 children, 4 daughters and a son, Alexis. Alexis was stricken with hemophobia, with hemophilia, which is a dangerous disease that could attack Alexis at any time after a mild fall or accident. It was a blood disease. So he was in very poor health, and the Tsarina was obsessed with the child's health and prayed for him. There were very few doctors that knew anything in those days. So mainly she prayed and was constantly looking for help for the boy. So in 1901, the workers, and there weren't that many, but the Industrial Revolution was starting to come in. Actually, the French and the English and German companies were starting to build in Russia. Why? You should know today why. cheap labor. Cheap labor, this time they'll go to Russia, next time they'll go to China, or who knows where. But they're always searching for cheap labor. So at that time, the workers, who were a very abused group, mainly children of ex-serfs, they started to form unions, and a socialist revolutionary party was formed. In 1902, social unrest is everywhere, and the working class movement grows in size and confidence. Nicholas, as most leaders usually do, responds with brutal tactics. He sends in the army, he's killing and injuring agitators, people who attend the pro-labor meetings are attacked. Social unrest is growing. And in 1902, as a point of note, the police in Odessa go out on strike because their working conditions are so poor, and they're learning about strikes. So the strike of the police cripples the city. There were mass protests. Miners revolted in Kiev and other areas. Nicholas does not comprehend or understand the depth of anger in the country. Instead, he blames the agitators, he blames the Jews, he blames communists, anybody but himself. His advisors rather agree with him at his harsh methods. And I'm going to give you a little aside now. It's a funny little aside. One of his semi-advisors, I call him semi because he never liked the guy, was Gregory Rasputin. You know, a lot of people have heard of Rasputin. Rasputin, Nicholas disliked Rasputin. The peasants hated him. The aristocracy hated him. Everybody but the Tsarina, Alexandra, who thought Rasputin had healing powers. So she loved Rasputin. I'm going to give you a little aside now on Rasputin. Rasputin was born in January of 1869 to a peasant family. He had a religious conversion experience after taking a pilgrimage in 1897. He was described as a monk or a wanderer, although he held no position in the Russian Orthodox Church. After traveling to St. Petersburg, either in 1903 or 1904, no one seems to know, Rasputin captivated some church and social leaders. He became a social figure and met the Tsars in 1905. In late 1906, Rasputin started acting as a healer for the wife. Somehow, whatever he did seemed to help the child when he was in trouble. But at court, he was a divisive, even by Russian standards, he was a mystic, visionary prophet, and by other standards, he was a religious charlatan. The high point of Rasputin's power was in 1915. I'm jumping ahead a little bit. This was after Nicholas left St. Petersburg to oversee the Russian armies in World War I. But Rasputin then increased his influence over Alexandria, who was running the country. He became increasingly unpopular, and he was assassinated. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the assassination, which is really funny. I guess death is never funny, but this was, it was like a black comedy. In December of 1916, I'm jumping ahead, it's just nothing to do with the revolution, really. The aristocracy in court conspired to kill him. So one of the princes, there were plenty of them in the court at that time, entices him to visit his palace by the river to meet with his wife who needed counseling. They put him in a waiting room, and they're playing a record on the gramophone, Yankee Doodle Dandy, which already starts with a joke. Rasputin sits in the waiting room and he's eating from a bowl of candy that was offered to him. The chocolates are laced with cyanide. So he's listening to Yankee Doodle Dandy and he's eating cyanide-laced chocolate. and he's drinking from a glass of poisoned Madeira wine that his host had provided. So they're really looking to put him out. However, he's a big, strong guy. And the toxins don't seem to have any immediate effect. So the conspirators start to panic and decide the best thing to do is shoot him. So now they shoot Rasputin. He's sitting there full of cyanide, and they start shooting him. Rasputin, with poison and bullets, rushes out into the snowy night. He's still walking at this point. And he's yelling, "I'm going to tell the Empress, I'm going to..." So that the assassins panic more, run after him, shoot him several more times. Rasputin falls, and laying in the snow, they beat him some more, hit him in the head, and put chains on him, and dump him in the river. Rasputin's not dead.
You sure about that?
Oh, yeah. All this is known because they left his boots, and the police eventually find his boots. Anyway, so Rasputin is still alive, and he's swimming. Now he's swimming upstream. With the chains, with the poisons, with the bullets, he's swimming. But he made one little mistake. When he hits some ice, there's an ice floe there, he's going to swim under it to get to the other side. But there was no other side. So eventually he gets drowned under the ice. And that's the end of Rasputin. But a little side effect, Rasputin had a daughter, Maria. And she escaped. I guess they were after her, but she escaped. She went to France. And after the revolution, she went to the U.S. to live. She worked as a lion tamer in the circus. And she died in 1977. So that's just a little aside, because Rasputin is really a funny figure. Okay, back to the story. Now we're back in 1902. Okay, so unrest is still growing in Russia, and the Russian Marxists held an organizing meeting in London, and opposition parties are formed all over Russia. The parties are named the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks, the Workers' Party, the Communist Party. Each organization had fresh leadership, and even the Jews had a party, but very few people responded. They were afraid to be other Jews. The police and the soldiers attacked, killing and injuring everybody in sight, jailing everybody who participated, who happened to be in the locale. Russia was one of the last major countries in Europe to experience social unrest, because the other countries had acquired the Industrial Revolution and some level of détente between labor and industry. But they were freed slaves, and they were still trying to increase their standard of living, and foreign agitators came in and were introduced to a literate population. So among the different philosophies that we're teaching, they were all based on the teaching of Karl Marx. Most of you heard about Karl Marx. I'll just tell you a little bit about him. He was not part of the revolution. He was born much earlier. Karl Marx was born in 1818 in the Kingdom of Prussia. There was no Germany in those days. It was the Kingdom of Prussia. He was a Jew, and therefore communism is always related to Jews somehow. And even today, when they talk about communists, they talk about Jews. So due to his political publications, Marx became stateless and lived in exile in London, where he continued to develop his thoughts. He collaborated with the German thinker Engels. He published his writing. The best writings were the 1948 pamphlet, the Communist Manifesto, and then he wrote a 3-volume set of books called Das Kapital. His political and philosophy had an enormous influence all over Europe, which now workers were starting to develop to a whole new group as well. Marx's theory about society, economics, and politics collectively was understood as Marxism, which then entered Russia in the early century. Marxism, although it's very complicated, but basically was a struggle between capitalism, the ruling classes, and the working classes. And Marx predicted that, like previous socioeconomic systems, capitalism produced internal tension and would lead to self-destruction and be replaced by a new system, socialism. So, and eventually the establishment of a classless communist society constituted by free association of producers. So he had ideas that were very attractive to workers who saw that they were the source of products and produce, and not the capitalists. Okay. So once again, back in 1895, I have to jump a little bit to talk about these organizations that were formed. The different Marxist-leaning groups then formed another group. See, too many groups are being formed. That's one of the problems when they start out here. This was called the Union of Struggle for the Liberation of the Working Class, and it was formed in Moscow. Moscow was not the capital then. It was a smaller city. It was a rural city, essentially. The Union brought together the Marxists, the Communists, the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks, and so on, Social Democrats. They tried to bring them together, but there was always friction between the different parties, different philosophies, and so on. And then again, in jumping to October of 1905, the All-Russian Peasants' Union meets and demands an abolishment of all private property and its reconstitution as common property. And in December, a general strike becomes a full-blown insurrection. So in January, this is called the Revolution of 1905. But it was put down in January of '06. The Tsar begins to crack down on the radicals, the police, the royal guards, the army, the Cossacks attack. And by the time the revolt is down, 15,000 were killed, 79,000 were hurt or imprisoned. Well, the Cossacks, I looked that one up, as you always hear about Cossacks. They're running through villages. It's an ethnic group from the Don region of the Ukraine. And they have a tradition of militarism and support for the government. Today we would sort of call them right-wing activists, but they were more militant and cruel. They're very, very cruel people. They didn't care about hurting other people. So leaders of the dissident groups start to emerge and take charge of their separate organizations. The founder of one group were two young activists. One was Yuli Tsendenbaum. He was known as Martov. In those days, the leaders of these groups didn't use their own name. They found another name that would sort of hide them and their family. So he was known as Martov. The other one was Vladimir Ulyanov, known as Lenin. So here's Lenin, that's not his real name, because they assume political names. Martov, the leader of the, one of the leaders there, is a 22-year-old Russian Jew. He's an intellectual, he's a weak leader, but he's a very, very clever, and people flock to him. Lenin, on the other hand, is a mesmerizing speaker. He's bold, he's strong, he's an excellent wordsmith and superb politician. He is clearly destined for future greatness, and I'll tell you a little bit about Lenin. Everybody heard of Lenin? I don't know whether I'm boring you, but everybody, I'll give you a little background. Lenin was born in 1870, and he came from a fairly wealthy middle-class family, but he embraced revolutionary socialist policies. He was not interested in any of this except his brother. His brother was very interested, and his brother was executed in 18 87. That generated a tremendous feeling in Lenin that he had to do something. He was exiled from the university for participating in protests, and he devoted years to a law degree. He moved to St. Petersburg in 1893, became a senior Marxist activist. In 1897, he was arrested for sedition, exiled for 3 years. He exiled presumably in Siberia, and he got married there. After his exile, he decided to leave Russia. He moved to Western Europe, where he became a theoretist in the Marxist Social Democratic Party, and he led the Bolshevik section against the Mensheviks, which was Montov's group, but he led them from Western Europe. So he moved around. He ended up, before the revolution, the October Revolution, he ended up in Switzerland. So he lived in Switzerland, wasn't party to any of the activities that were going on there. He returned only in October when the revolution the change of government was in full force. Okay, but he firmly believed that Marxism would overthrow capitalism and be replaced by socialism. He died, incidentally, in January 1924. Okay. Back to the early 1900s. Sorry to jump around like this, but you sort of have to follow a thread, like where the guy went. So back in the early 90s, the Russian government recognizes a lot of unrest. You have to look at the things that government does, which they do today, someplace. The Russian prime minister says to the Tsar, what we need is a nice little victorious war to stem the tide of revolution. So they're going to get a distraction to stem the tide of revolution. And what better foil is there than Japan? Because Nicholas considers the Japanese a lesser race of little monkeys. And therefore he decides we can wipe them out, no problem, we'll have a big victory, everybody will admire us, and the armed forces. So the Russo-Japanese War began in February of 1904. The Russians expected an easy victory, but the Russians were poorly led. The leaders of the Russian army were always nobility. They didn't really have any training. And the privates in the army were illiterate serfs, ex-serfs. So they started attacking through Siberia. They were attacking Japan, and they had a fleet that came around attacking Japan. But they were routed at Port Arthur with devastating losses. Terrible losses fueled further unrest and counterattacks against the dissidents and routed. In other words, the people heard about these losses. This stimulated them more. The more they were stimulated, the more the Tsar came down on them. In May of 1905, the Russian Baltic Fleet, they had a fair-sized navy at that time, Russia. The Baltic Fleet, however, ran into the Japanese, who had a better fleet, were better armed and better managed, and they were destroyed. The Baltic Fleet was destroyed, and that began another insurrection in the battleship, and the sailors revolted. At that point, the first Soviet is formed. The word Soviet, in Russian, the word means roughly a council or a gathering of forces. It's a word that continued on through the Soviet Union and so on. So somebody was heckling me there. In September, the war with Russia, in September the war ends with Russia ceding some Russian territories to Japan to end the war. However, this causes civil unrest, and Nicholas has to grant some civil liberties. But in April, the aristocracy issues a fundamental laws. The well-known point of departure there was in April 1906. The fundamental laws told the peasants that God had given the aristocracy their right to govern. This was a theme that all of history, people tell you that they have a God-given right to govern. Where that came from, I don't know. Okay, but in the beginning of the 20th century, the Russian Empire was a huge, huge empire. It stretched from the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea and from Poland to the Pacific. Population was about 126 million, consisting of many races: Slavs, Turks, Tartars, Jews, and a multitude of other different cultures. Nearly 4/5 of the people are peasants, tied to the soil and illiterate. Their religion consisted of the Orthodox Church, which was an offshoot of Roman Catholicism, and Buddhism, other sects. In the city's industry is starting out, and imports from Western Europe are new. So the West sees the opportunity to have lower wages and their products to train, and workers for their products. So they want to train the illiterate Russian peasant and to operate new machines. And the Russian peasants, getting a little bit more money, decide that they can revolt a little bit. Okay, just want to give you one aside. Bolsheviks, everybody seems to use the word Bolsheviks, so I looked it up, didn't know what Bolsheviks really was. Bolshevik, the Russian word, means one of the majority. So Bolsheviks are people who feel they're in the majority party, and they should be. The Mensheviks, which was the other party, was one of the minority, and the Bolsheviks looked down on them. Lenin headed the Bolshevik minority, a Bolshevik group. There was also the Social Democratic Party, and the Russian Social Democrats joined Lenin in 1912. Okay, moving ahead now. So we're going to jump. There were various unrests and put-downs and different, but I won't go into all of them. Let's jump to June of 1914. In June of 1914, the Archduke of Austria was assassinated by the young Bosnian separatists. In July, the Austro-Hungary Empire issues an ultimatum to Serbia, demanding the right to participate in the investigation of the assassination. Serbia refuses, and Austro-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Russia then starts mobilizing its forces, and Germany, which is part of the Central Powers, which was Germany, Austria-Hungary, and so on, becomes part of Germany, which is part of the Central Powers, presents a ultimatum to Russia. So you never quite know what they're going to do. Now, the Russian mobility, it's interesting also, the Russian mobility were all related by blood and intermarriage. Everybody was a cousin to this one, an uncle to that one, an aunt to that one. England, Germany, Russia, Spain, France all had monarchs that were related to each other. They were cousins and so on. Nicholas of Russia, the Tsar, was a cousin of Wilhelm, the Kaiser of Germany. So since they were cousins and they were polite people, they exchanged notes about the war. So there's records of notes being sent between Dear Willie and Dear Nicky, talking about the war. So here's the two talking and chatting to each other. the result being the death of millions of people in World War I. Okay. So these exchange of polite telegrams take place, but they are trying to resolve the situation. But after European hostilities begin in July, Nicholas takes Russia into war. At the beginning of the war in Russia, World War I, patriotism flourishes. As in any war, patriotism will always be the first thing. Everybody is protecting their country. The country rallies around Nicholas. And all across Europe, Marxists, socialists, labor rally to the government. In Russia, the Duma, which is essentially the government legislature, although they had very little power. The Russian Duma supports the war, but the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks walk out and protest. They're the only groups that protested against the war. Russia mobilizes quickly and invades East Prussia to aid France, which is under pressure on the Western Front. However, the Russian armed forces are poorly run. They're run by by aristocracy who know nothing militarily, and soon their offensive is halted. Also, the high command is inept and corrupt. So dissatisfaction with the Russian government, the Russian government's conduct of the war grows, and Tsar Nicholas decides to go to the front personally to take charge. This further compounds the leadership problem because they don't know who's running the armed forces now. And Alexandria, the Tsarina, becomes the acting head of the Russian government. Her incompetence draws protests and strikes and further cripples the ability of industry to support the Russian armed forces. The German army goes on the offensive and invades Russia and Poland. So in August of 1915, the German army enters Warsaw, and in September they capture the capital of Lithuania. The death and casualties in the Russian army is horrendous in the millions, since the generals have little use for Russian lives. Soon Nicholas orders more conscription, stretching all the way to the Central Asian population. In November 1916, Germany established the independent kingdom of Poland. So Poland, which has gone back and forth between Germany and Russia, is now established as a satellite of Germany. By the beginning of 1917, Russia's in full upheaval. Everybody has lost someone in the war. Millions of men have died or have been died in poor medical treatment. And the only thing that holds up the German army is the Russian winter. So the German army is stuck at the beginning of 1917 because winter is coming in. However, winter is also killing Russian soldiers who are poorly equipped, don't have clothing, don't have blankets. And so in March of 1917, demonstrations begin in the Russian capital, culminating in the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II. So Tsar Nicholas abdicates. You may learn later about his other murder and so on, but at this point in time he abdicates, and he and his family live in their palace alongside the river. And the very weak provisional government is formed to govern Russia after Nicholas abdicates. This arrangement leads to more confusion, and the front weakens more further, the war front. Generals come back from the army because they are threatened, their families are threatened. The army becomes ineffective and chaos reigns. Following the Tsar's abdication, Lenin then decides to come back. And he comes back from Switzerland to St. Petersburg by train. Now the ride of Lenin from Switzerland to St. Petersburg Through the War Lines is a book in itself. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was a movie or a television show. Lenin by Train, I think was the name of it. But it was a fantastic thing. I don't know whether he was on the same train all the time, or he had to change trains, but he had to go through the German lines and he had to go through the Russian lines in order to arrive back in St. Petersburg. Finally, he arrives in St. Petersburg in April 1917. And he arrives in time to assume the leadership of the Bolshevik Party, which has now become very popular. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, demand an immediate end to the war. So Russia is now in full turmoil. The army, which is sent to respond, don't respond. In July, another party, the Soviets, or as I say, the Council, becomes popular, leading to more demonstrations in the streets. And what's left of any parliament tries the country by electing Kerensky as a prime minister in July 1917. Who is Kerensky? I'll tell you if I can find it.
Alexander Kerensky.
Here's Kerensky.
The worst.
Kerensky was the closest one to a democratic Alexander Kerensky was a Russian lawyer and revolutionary. He was a key political figure in the Russian Revolution. He was born in, where was he born? In 1881. So he wasn't such a young man either. But he formed the government in the early part of the revolution after the Tsar was abdicated. So he's got an interesting background, but it's getting late, so I can't go into it too much. He was born in 1881. He was the eldest son of a family. His father was a teacher. He basically was a kinder man than some of the other radicals were. He tried to form a Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party didn't take over. People were all discontent and wanted more radical action. So Kerensky was a moderate lawyer. He was an orator and politician who opposed Lenin's Bolsheviks, but his position as head of government was weak and soon was overcome by Lenin. Lenin was then elected chairman of the Council of the People's Commissars. So this is the first indication that you have. Now, you haven't heard me mention Stalin at all. You haven't heard me mention Trotsky. So all these guys come later on in the story. So Lenin was now the most powerful man in Russia, and on October 17th, which is the nominal date of the Russian Revolution, October 1917, the Second All-Russia Congress was convened. The Mensheviks and other moderates walked out, and the Congress elected Lenin, its chairman, with power to run the country. The Congress also issued the Declaration of Peace, approved the expropriation of land from the nobility. Now this was a tremendous step, because suddenly the government is taking land from the nobility as common land for a country that did not recognize, the nobility recognized the workers' rights. So I think we're going to end at this point, because Lenin then starts to negotiate with the war power, with the Central Powers, and eventually makes a separate peace with them. But that's a whole other story. And then after that peace, there's a war between the whites and the reds. But maybe next year we'll go into that. So thank you very much. Complicated business. Anybody have questions that I can answer?
I want to make a comment. If you've ever been to the Hermitage, in St. Petersburg.
I've been there.
Okay, and I don't know how many people have been to the Hermitage of St. Petersburg. They have one of the most fabulous art collections in the world. The Russian aristocracy accumulated this great art all throughout Europe.
Yeah, mainly from from France and other places.
France and other places, yeah. They purchased it.
Right.
They didn't steal it.
Yeah, right. They had the money to purchase it.
And you go see the Hermitage, and you say, now I know why there was a revolution.
The Hermitage, the building, was a castle, was a palace. It was a palace. It's overwhelmingly large. You can't get through. It's like the Louvre Museum,
Yeah.
which is also an old palace. You can wander through it for days. You won't see it all.
That's right.
And the Hermitage is not as well organized as the Louvre is, so things are all piled in.
My memory of the Hermitage was from 1989, and the display of the art itself was poor, and the walls were grayish, and I think they did it over, and now it's very beautiful.
Yeah, that's what I hear.
But I was left with a, God.
That's
all
what
this beauty.
I was there right after the Soviets
It was
stopped.
just after Perestroika.
Right.
It was at the end of that. Yeah.
That's why I was there. Maybe we met there. Anybody else?
Even though the Jews, with the anti-Semitism that they had throughout Europe, the Russian army were drafting all the Jews that they got their hands on.
Oh, sure.
And
Sure.
many Jews were running away from the wars, etc., right? But even with the anti-Semitism, they still wanted them
Oh,
in their
sure.
army.
Well, the Russian army, and there have been movies and plays done about it, had very little use for the common soldier. They were cannon fodder. They were piled of dead, one on top of the other. The aristocracy didn't care. They figured they were expendable. The one weapon they had was manpower. The Russians always had huge manpower. Bring in another wave of conscripts, they'll kill them all, right? Sir?
An interesting fact about the Russo-Japanese War was that Teddy Roosevelt negotiated the peace and won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906 for that.
No, that's interesting. Okay, in that case, thank you very much.